June 22nd, 1941, 5:15 in the morning. The outskirts of Brest. The air no longer trembled. It rang. But this was not a sound, but its absence. An absolute, deafening void that bored into the eardrums with the persistence of a white-hot needle. It was the silence that comes after the world has been torn to pieces and stitched back together with coarse, rotten threads. Around the position of the 85th anti-aircraft battery, the earth had turned into a black, smoldering mess. It was hot to the touch, like a gigantic, hastily extinguished bonfire. And from it rose a nauseating smell of ozone, burnt metal, scorched grass, and something else. Something Swedish that turned the stomach. The sky, which only an hour ago had first been steel gray, then black with smoke and countless enemy machines, now stretched over this hell with an innocent, almost mocking blueness. And in that bottomless, pure azure lay fate's cruelest jest. The enemy was gone. The enemy had had its fill and left, leaving behind only death and this deafening silence. Sergeant Anna Kovaleva stood by her gun, or rather by its mangled carcass. The steel barrel, heated to such a degree that the air above it shimmered and distorted as if in a mirage, was stubbornly raised to the zenith, like a petrified finger still threatening the empty abyss. The massive gun carriage was twisted, one of the wheels torn off by an explosion and thrown far to the side. The trails dug so deep into the ground, it was as if they were trying to hold on to the last patch of their native land with roots. The entire area around was littered with spent casings. Hundreds of smoking brass cylinders covered the ground in a thick, clinking carpet, like leaves in a dead autumn forest. Anna didn't hear the silence. In her ears, inside her skull, in every cell of her body, the battle raged on. The incessant, mind-numbing drone still hung there. The roar of 1,000 engines, the deafening thunder of explosions, the high-pitched, thin shriek of shrapnel, and the screams of her girls, her own screams. She slowly lowered her gaze to her hands. They were black with soot, gunpowder residue, and someone else's dried blood under her nails. Her hands trembled with a fine, continuous, humiliating tremor that she couldn't stop, no matter how hard she clenched her fists. She was alone. Of the entire crew, of the 6 girls who just last night, only a few hours ago, had sat in this very spot, laughing and dreaming of shore leave, she was the only one left standing. The others lay here, having become part of this terrible landscape. Katya Sokolova, her genius gunner, lay curled up in a ball by the shattered sight, her fragile figure looking utterly childlike. The tunic on her back was soaked with something dark and wet. Daria Zubova, their eternal rebel, sat leaning against a trail, staring into the void with unseeing, wide-open eyes, silently whispering something with lips torn to shreds. Lena. She forbade herself to think about Lena. Thinking about Lena was physically painful, as if a red-hot bayonet was being driven into her chest. A direct hit on the ammunition box. There was nothing left of her. Nothing at all. Only a patch of grass scorched to a glassy crust and a small, miraculously intact white handkerchief with an embroidered cornflower border, which she always carried in her breast pocket. Anna Kovaleva was 19 years old. She was the commander of this small female hell, and she had survived. She didn't know why. She didn't know for what purpose. She just stood there, breathing in that terrible stench, and looked at the sky that, just an hour ago, had been her personal mortal enemy. At that moment, she didn't yet know that this hour, these 60 damn minutes, would become her entire real life. That all the following decades would be but a pale, faded epilogue to this bloody dawn. She didn't know that her desperate, furious battle would be erased from the official chronicles, drowned in the bottomless ocean of chaos and defeat of the war's first day, transformed into a vague soldier's legend, told only in whispers. She just stood there, a shell-shocked, deafened 19-year-old girl, by her red-hot, forever-silenced gun, trying to piece together the fragments of her shattered world. How could this have happened? How could the world end in a single hour? But to understand how a crew of young female gunners, dreaming of movies and ice cream, was reduced to a lone, scorched figure on a burnt field, we must go back just a few hours, to the last night of peace. To that quiet, warm June evening when they still sincerely believed in tomorrow. June 21st, 1941, 10 o'clock at night. The battery was skillfully hidden in a small pine grove, not far from a strategically important bridge. The air was thick and warm, infused with the aromas of the fading day. It smelled of pine needles heated by the sun, the bitter scent of blooming clover, and of course, machine oil. That sharp, technical smell was the eternal companion of any military position. It had seeped into their clothes, their skin, their hair. It was an almost pastoral scene, if not for the sinister silhouettes of 4 steel monsters concealed under the green canopies, 85mm anti-aircraft guns, model 1939. The girls of Sergeant Kovaleva's crew were finishing the evening maintenance of their gun, which they called Our Little Swallow. They did it with a practiced, almost domestic skill, as if tidying a room before guests arrived. Anna Kovaleva, a short but sturdily built girl with serious gray eyes and a heavy, tightly woven braid, was personally checking the breech block, wiping it with an oily rag until it shone like a mirror. To her, the gun was not just a piece of metal. She treated it like a living, temperamental but reliable comrade that demanded constant care and respect. Nearby, Katya Sokolova, a thin, angular girl in large, round glasses, a former student of the physics and mathematics department, was working her magic on the complex Zeiss optics of the site. She muttered something to herself about elevation angles, parallax, and wind correction, her slender fingers flitting over the dials and hand wheels with the virtuosity of a pianist. Katya was the brain of the crew, their secret, unexpected weapon. She could perform the most complex ballistic calculations in her head, stupefying even seasoned artillery officers. Daria Zubova, tall and sharp with a perpetual smirk in her dark eyes, was ramming a heavy cleaning rod down the barrel with a strength she didn't seem to possess, clearing out the remnants of gunpowder from the day's training drills. Daria was their voice of despair, the eternal skeptic and rebel who considered this whole service a pointless game of playing soldier. But she did her job with a fierce, angry precision, as if venting all her pent-up energy on the metal. The youngest, Lena Orlova, bustled around the ammunition boxes, lovingly wiping each heavy shell, which resembled a giant cartridge. She was only 18 and she still looked at the world with wide, naive eyes. She talked the most about home, about her fiancé, a tractor driver who wrote her long, touching letters, and about the polka-dot silk dress she would definitely sew for herself after demobilization. They were so different, these girls, brought together from all corners of the vast country by a volunteer drive of the Komsomol, the Young Communist League. They were united by one thing, a strange, intoxicating sense of being part of something big, important, almost sacred, the defense of their motherland's sky. After dinner, they sat on the parapet of their gun pit, and Lena read aloud in a low voice a fresh letter from her fiancé. It was a simple, clumsy text, full of village news about the sowing season and awkward but sincere declarations of love. They listened with bated breath, each lost in her own thoughts. Anna remembered her mother, left behind in a small town in the Urals, Katya, the resonant silence of the university library, and the magical smell of old books. Daria didn't remember anyone. She just smoked cheap, foul-smelling Makorka tobacco, blowing smoke rings into the darkening sky, and watched the sunset, which was slowly turning an alarming shade of crimson. "It's going to be windy," she said hoarsely, breaking the silence. "Or maybe it means blood. The old folks say a sunset like this is a bad omen." Lena looked at her, frightened, but Katya immediately countered that it was just the scattering of light on dust particles in the upper atmosphere. This was one of those small, unsettling signs that no one paid serious attention to. The second sign appeared later, around midnight. From the direction of the border, which was only a few kilometers, a couple of miles away, came a strange, low, vibrating rumble. Not planes, not tanks. Something else unfamiliar, as if the earth itself was groaning under an immense weight. They asked Lieutenant Orlov, their young platoon commander, fresh out of officer school, what it was. He waved it off carelessly, suggesting it was the Germans on the other side of the Bug River, conducting another one of their large-scale exercises. "Get some sleep, girls. Tomorrow is Sunday, and they're promising leave to go into town after lunch. So, knock off the panic. Leave to go into town." Those were magical, intoxicating words. They immediately forgot about the rumble and the sunset and began chattering, discussing which dress to wear, who would go to the cinema to see the film Volga Volga, and who would go to the park for dancing. They made plans for tomorrow, not suspecting that this tomorrow would never come for them. That night, Anna couldn't sleep for a long time. She lay in her cramped dugout, inhaling the thick smell of damp earth and pine roots, and listened to the silence. But the silence felt somehow artificial, stretched taut like a string about to snap. A vague, sticky anxiety like a spider's web stirred somewhere deep in her soul. She thought about her gun, which stood up there silently pointing its long barrel at the dark, star-dusted sky. She didn't yet know that in a few hours, this beautiful, peaceful sky would turn into a bottomless, roaring hell from which a rain of fire would pour down on them. That evening, as she checked the breech block for the last time, she gently stroked the cold armor of her gun, not suspecting that in a few hours, that armor would be the only barrier between her and death. She didn't know that her next order would not be for a drill, but for combat. The first and the last for most of her girls. 4 o'clock in the morning. That dead point on the clock face when the night is already dead and the day has not yet been born. A pre-dawn gloom, grey and cold as a shroud, lay on the ground, soaked with heavy dew. The birds had not yet begun their morning roll call. It was in this ringing primordial silence on the very border between darkness and light that it began. First came the sound, not even a sound but rather an infrasound, a vibration. A low, oppressive drone that seemed to come not from any specific direction, but from everywhere at once. It was born somewhere in the bowels of the earth, traveled up through the soles of their boots, along their bones, and simultaneously fell from the heavens, making the very air vibrate. The girl on telephone duty who had dozed off at her post at first thought it was a dream, a nightmare, but the drone didn't go away. It grew slowly, relentlessly, becoming denser, heavier, filling all space, squeezing out the silence. It made the glass chimney of the kerosene lamp tremble, the earth, their teeth. Anna rushed out of the dugout, buttoning her tunic on the go. Her heart was pounding somewhere in her throat with rapid, panicked thumps. She looked to the west, towards the border, and she saw it. The entire horizon, from edge to edge, from one point to another, was filled with a moving, living, pulsating black mass. These were not individual dots of airplanes, as in the drills. It was a solid, multi-layered, roaring wall that was crawling across the lightening sky, devouring the pre-dawn blue. Hundreds, thousands of airplanes. They came in waves, in echelons, at different altitudes, creating a multi-level roaring river of steel, gasoline, and death in the sky. Junkers Ju-88S, Heinkel He-111S and their escort fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109S. The entire monstrous power of the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet hurled at a single, narrow sector of the front. This was the main shockwave of Operation Barbarossa, and their small anti-aircraft battery, lost in the woods by a cruel twist of fate, found itself directly in its path. The first few seconds weren't even shock. It was a complete stupor, a paralysis of consciousness. The brain refused to accept what the eyes were seeing. This couldn't be happening. It was some monstrous mistake, a grandiose exercise, a provocation of unprecedented scale. But then the ground ahead, right at the border, silently heaved. Dozens, hundreds of bright, blinding flashes lit up the horizon, and only after a few long, viscous moments did the thunder reach them, a heavy, ragged sound as if some giant was tearing the thick fabric of the universe to shreds. War. That short, terrible word they had only heard in movies and read in newspapers suddenly ceased to be an abstraction. It became reality. It was here, in this roaring sky, in this trembling earth, in the smell of burning that the first gust of wind brought. Lieutenant Orlov ran out of his dugout, pale as death, with wild, uncomprehending eyes. He tried to shout something, to open his mouth, but his voice was drowned in the rising roar. The line to command was silent. The telephone wires, as it turned out later, had been cut by saboteurs an hour ago. They were alone, blind and deaf in the face of the apocalypse. The girls poured out of the dugouts, some in their underclothes, frightened, bewildered. They looked at the sky, and on their young faces was a primal animal terror. The armada was almost upon them. The huge black silhouettes of the bombers with crosses on their wings blotted out the sky, and a premature, ominous shadow fell upon the earth. And at that very moment, Anna Kovaleva understood. She suddenly understood with absolute chilling clarity that no one was going to give an order. That Lieutenant Orlov, their commander, was broken, paralyzed by fear. That if something wasn't done right now, this very second, they would all die here without firing a single shot, like frightened rabbits before a boa constrictor. She looked at her gun, then at her terrified, crying girls, and the fear inside her, sticky and cold, was suddenly replaced by something else. A cold, ringing, crystalline fury. Her entire small, cozy world, her dreams, her 19 years of life, all of it was flying at her from the sky to crush and destroy her, and she decided to fight. She ran to the gun, her boots sinking into the dewy grass. "To your battle stations!" Her voice cracked, sounding thin and uncertain, almost childish. No one moved. They looked at her as if she were insane. "To your stations, I said!" She screamed again, and this time steel cut through her voice. The steel spine that had been dormant within her all this time had awakened. She grabbed Katya by the shoulder, shook her hard. "Sokolova, to the site! Zubova, Lena, shells, quickly, for fuck's sake, quickly!" And they obeyed. Not because they understood the order, but because in this total, deafening chaos, her scream was the only island of order, the only meaning. They scrambled to their places, acting on pure automatism, obeying the muscle memory drilled into their bodies by months of endless grueling training. Daria and Lena tore open the heavy lids of the ammunition boxes. Katya, stumbling, pressed her face to the cold eyepiece of the sight. Anna herself took the position of the gun commander. The first bomb fell in the forest, about 200 meters, roughly 650 feet from them. The ground shook so violently they could barely stay on their feet. A giant fountain of earth, uprooted pine trees, and fire shot upwards. A hot, elastic wave of air hit their faces. And at that moment, Anna gave the first real combat order of her life. On the lead bomber, shrapnel, fuse 15, load. Her world narrowed to the eyepiece of the panoramic sight, to the markings on the scale, and to the black cross of the enemy plane crawling slowly across the reticle. The first minutes of the battle devolved into a surreal, fiery nightmare where reality blended with the most terrifying of dreams. The world as they had known it just 5 minutes ago had vanished. All that remained was a deafening, continuous, vibrating roar that merged the bellow of hundreds of aircraft engines, the dry, sharp, ear-splitting bark of their own gun, and the dull, ground-shaking thuds of explosions. Around their position, fountains of black earth began to rise as if in slow motion. The bombs fell closer and closer, with a scream that seemed to rip the very fabric of the air. The Germans, obviously not expecting to encounter organized resistance here, deep behind the lines, decided to suppress the defiant anti-aircraft gun immediately upon discovering it. The girls worked at a feverish, desperate, almost insane pace. The fear hadn't gone away. It was here. It lived inside them. It constricted their muscles with an icy cold, making their hearts beat so fast it felt like they would break through their ribs and leap out. But on top of this all-consuming fear lay a thin but strong layer of automatism, drilled into them by hundreds of hours of training on the firing range. Their hands did what they were supposed to do, while their minds refused to believe what was happening. Daria and Lena, two small, fragile figures, hold heavy 25-kilogram shells, slippery with grease, from the boxes. Their faces were wet with sweat and tears they didn't notice. With great effort, straining, they lifted them, placed them in the loading tray. Anna yelled commands, her voice breaking, drowned out by the general din, but they understood her gestures, the movement of her lips, the furious glint in her eyes. Katya, glued to the sight's eyepiece, desperately tried to catch the darting, receding target in her crosshairs. She was crying ceaselessly, hot tears streaming down her cheeks, flooding the eyepiece. But again and again she wiped them away with a dirty tunic sleeve and cranked the heavy traverse and elevation wheels. Their enemy wasn't just big. It was as endless as the ocean. The planes came in a continuous, unrelenting stream. It seemed it would never end. They fired at one, but dozens more immediately appeared in its place. This wasn't a battle. It was a desperate attempt to fend off a school of hungry sharks with an oar. The first few shots went wide, hitting the milk, as the soldiers said. The shells burst somewhere behind and below the enemy machines, leaving only harmless, cotton-like white puffs in the sky. In despair, Anna bit her lip until it bled. She understood they were doing something wrong. The sight settings learned on the training grounds, calculated for slow-moving practice targets, didn't work here. The speed and altitude of real combat aircraft were completely different. Katya, double the lead. Do you hear me? Double it.
They're coming in faster than we thought,
she screamed into the gunner's ear, trying to be heard over the roar of the engines. Katya nodded feverishly, her face as white as a sheet. She gripped the hand wheels, her slender fingers turning white from the strain.
Load!
Anna screamed again. With a metallic clang, Daria rammed another shell into the warm, gunpowder-scented breech. The breech block snapped shut like a guillotine.
Fire!
A shot. The gun recoiled with its entire multi-ton body sliding back on its rails, and with a furious hiss, ejected a smoking, hell-scented casing from the breech. Everyone instinctively ducked, and at that moment, they saw it. One of the Junkers, flying in the lead group, suddenly lurched in the air as if it had tripped over an invisible obstacle. It nosed down, and thick, greasy black smoke began to pour from its right wing. It started to roll over slowly, almost lazily, falling out of its impeccably straight combat formation. Inside their small, horror-stricken world, a deafening silence reigned for a single, precious second. They watched, holding their breath, as the crippled bomber, leaving a mournful black trail behind it, entered a flat spin. Small, dark figures began to tumble from its steel belly, the crew bailing out with parachutes. And then the plane slammed into the ground somewhere beyond the forest, and a giant pillar of fire and smoke rose into the sky, resembling a blossoming flower of death. It was their first victory. A small, almost accidental, hopeless victory, but it was theirs. and it changed everything. The primal terror in their eyes was replaced by something else, a wicked, desperate, almost hysterical euphoria. They could do it. They could kill them. They could fight. Shell! Daria was no longer shouting but roaring, her face contorted into a furious, bestial grimace. They began to work more cohesively, faster, more viciously. They were no longer frightened little girls in military uniforms. They were a crew, a single well-oiled organism fused with its steel gun. But their triumph was short-lived. The sky did not become clearer. On the contrary, it seemed there were even more planes. And now they knew where their enemy was. Several nimble Messerschmitts broke away from the main group and, turning, went into a dive straight for their position. With a howl that chilled the blood in their veins, they streaked over the very tops of the pines, strafing the ground with a fiery rain from their rapid-fire cannons and machine guns. Bullets clattered against the gun's shield, striking bright showers of sparks. One of them hit an ammunition box with a sickening whine, and Lena screamed in terror. Communication with command was still silent. Lieutenant Orlov lay face down in his dugout, covering his head with his arms, trembling uncontrollably. The other crews of the neighboring guns were either destroyed by the first bombs, or their commanders, unlike Anna, were unable to overcome their fear and give the order to open fire. They were alone, a small, lonely island of furious, hopeless resistance in a boundless ocean of fire and chaos. The first victory, intoxicating as strong wine, gave them only a brief respite, just one gulp of air before they plunged back into the fiery abyss. The enemy, recovering from their unexpected audacity, unleashed all its methodical, merciless fury upon them. Now they were not just a random target, but a specific point marked on the flight maps, a point that had to be wiped from the face of the earth. And the system that Anna had instinctively begun to build in the first minutes of the battle was put to its first serious test. It was a system born of despair and chaos, a system where there was no room for thoughts, feelings, or fear. There was only the ruthless, mechanical, soul-crushing rhythm: shell, load, fire. Anna realized that the only way to survive and continue the fight was to turn her crew into a living, feeling extension of the gun. She herself became the heart of this terrible mechanism, setting its frantic pace. "Zubova, don't wait for the command. As soon as the casing is ejected, feed the next shell," she shouted, her voice rising above the thunder. "Lena, drag the boxes closer to the gun. Don't run for one shell at a time. Katya, ignore the fighters. They're just a distraction. Work on the bombers. They're the main target." She established a dictatorship. A cruel, merciless dictatorship of combat. There was no longer Sergeant Kovaleva, nor her friends Katya, Dasha, and Lena. There were only faceless crew numbers: first, second, third, fourth. Each knew her task, and the lives of all the others depended on its lightning-fast execution. They created their own small, desperate empire out of nothing, in the midst of a gaping hell. Their capital was the cramped gun pit. Their only law, Anna's short, sharp commands. Their only goal, their only reason for existence, to shoot down planes, to send those black cross-bearing birds to hell. The bombs fell ever closer. One of them exploded so near that they were all thrown to the ground like rag dolls. A hot, elastic wave of air seared their eyebrows and hair. Earth, damp and heavy, poured down their collars, filled their mouths, grated on their teeth. Anna was deafened for several long seconds. When the agonizing ringing in her ears subsided a little, she raised her head and saw Katya lying on the ground, motionless. Thin trickles of blood flowed from her nose and ears. A concussion. Anna, feeling no pain from her numerous scrapes, crawled to her, shook her. "Katya, Katya, wake up, get up!" The girl struggled to open her eyes. Her gaze was hazy, vacant. She didn't understand where she was or what was happening. But the sky wouldn't wait. A new wave of bombers was already bearing down on them, as inexorable as fate. "Get up!" Anna yanked the limp Katya to her feet with inhuman strength, forcibly pressing her to the sight's eyepiece. "Look! Do you see it? Aim!" She jabbed her finger at the sky, at another black cross crawling across it. And Katya, obeying not the meaning of the words but the imperious, hypnotic tone, began to turn the handwheels. Her movements were slow, uncertain, like a drunkard's, but she was working. This was the very surgical cruelty that is not written about in manuals and regulations. Anna could not afford the luxury of pitying anyone. She was a surgeon who had to save the entire organism, even if it meant inflicting unbearable pain on its individual parts. Their unexpected weapon, Katya's brilliant mind, had failed, but the system Anna had built continued to function convulsively. They shot down another plane. This time it was a heavy Heinkel. It flared up in the air like a Christmas candle and broke apart before it even hit the ground. Its burning debris rained down on the forest. This second victory no longer brought the same euphoria. It brought only a grim, heavy, exhausting satisfaction. They were still alive. They were still fighting. But the hostile environment seemed only to be gaining strength. From the continuous, frantic firing, the gun barrel grew red hot. The protective paint on it began to bubble and peel, emitting a caustic, choking smoke. The air around them shimmered with heat, like in a smithy. Each shot now felt particularly heavy, accompanied by a sick, strained, grating sound. The mechanisms, their lubricant burning away, began to work with difficulty, to jam. Their gun, their only protector and savior, their little swallow, was dying before their eyes. And it was at that very moment, when it seemed things couldn't possibly get worse, that their desperate system, built on blood and will, developed a deep crack from within. They had been working for almost an hour without a single second's break, a whole hour in hell. Time had lost its usual linear flow. It either compressed into a single short, fiery, blinding moment between shots, or it stretched into an endless, viscous eternity, thick as tar, waiting for the next bomb to fall. Their bodies were working at the very limit of human capability. Their muscles burned with inhuman strain, a lump of dust, gunpowder fumes, and fear was lodged in their throats. But worse than the physical exhaustion was the moral depletion. The human psyche is simply not designed for such a transcendent level of terror, and it began to break, to crumble like dried clay. Daria was the first to break. The same Daria Zubova who, in the first minutes of the battle, had worked with the fury of a woman possessed. She had just rammed another shell home, and when Anna commanded fire, as usual, Daria suddenly froze. She straightened to her full height, dropped her hands, and stared at the roaring sky with crazed, wide-open eyes in which pure, unadulterated horror swirled. "Enough," she whispered with her lips alone. "What? I didn't hear you."
Louder!
Anna shouted, not taking her eye off the panoramic sight.
Enough, I said.
Daria's voice broke into a shrill, hysterical scream. "This is all pointless, can't you see? There are thousands of them, thousands, and we're all alone. We're all going to die here for nothing." It was the voice of despair, not cowardice, no, but of the terrible, suffocating, irrefutable truth that each of them had been pushing away, but which sat like an icy worm in the depths of their souls. Her words, like poison, instantly seeped into the consciousness of the others. Lena froze with a shell in her hands. Her lips began to tremble and tears streamed from her eyes. Even the concussed, detached Katya tore herself away from the sight and looked at Anna with a mute, desperate question in her eyes. The system had failed. The mechanism had stopped. "Zubova, to the gun!"
"Now!"
Anna commanded, trying to make her voice sound firm and confident like steel.
"No!"
Daria laughed hysterically, a wild, girlish sound. "I won't. I want to live. Do you understand, you fool? Live. We have to run. Into the woods. Hide."
"Before we're all blown to kingdom come."
She took a step to climb out of the life-saving trench. And at that moment, Anna knew that if she let Daria go, panic would spread like the plague. It would be the end. Instant and inglorious. She lunged at Daria, grabbing her by the shoulders so hard that her joints cracked. "Stay put. Let me go." Daria struggled, her strong body thrashing in Anna's grip.
"Do you want us all to burn alive here? For what?"
Their eyes met. In Daria's eyes was animal, primal terror. In Anna's, a cold, merciless, inhuman determination. Anna drew back her hand, and with all her strength, pouring all her fury and all her despair into the blow, she slapped Daria across the face. The sound of the slap was sharp, stinging, and humiliating. It was drowned out by the general din of battle, but in their small, cramped trench, it sounded like a cannon shot. Daria staggered back, pressing a hand to her instantly reddening cheek. On her face was not so much pain as shock and astonishment. "You will follow my command," Anna hissed, staring her down with a scorching gaze. "One more word, one more attempt to run, and I will shoot you, right here. Understood?" She didn't know if she could actually do it, but there was so much icy, inhuman certainty in her voice that Daria believed her. She nodded slowly, as if in a dream. The mutiny was suppressed. Cruelly, humiliatingly, but effectively. Anna felt neither anger nor satisfaction, only a cold, burnt-out emptiness. She had just struck her friend. She had threatened her with a weapon. The war was incinerating their souls, turning them into monsters to give their bodies a chance to survive. Daria, sobbing with pain and humiliation, returned to her post at the breach. Lena, looking at Anna fearfully, as if at a strange, terrifying person, picked up the shell again. The system was running again. They had been saved from the enemy within. But while they fought each other, they failed to notice that their main external enemy was preparing its final devastating blow. From the sky, from the very center of the air armada, a single predatory dot detached itself. It did not fall at an angle like ordinary bombs. It fell almost vertically, and its descent was accompanied by a rising, soul-tearing, inhuman wail. It was a Ju-87, a Stuka, a dive bomber, and it was diving straight at them. The wail of a diving Junker's siren is not just a sound, it is an acoustic weapon, the sound of hell itself, which once heard can never be forgotten. It paralyzes the will, gets under the skin, burrows into the very brain, evoking a primal animal terror. It was a diabolically clever psychological trick, designed to break the enemy before the bomb even fell. And it almost worked. The girls froze as if hypnotized, their faces turned up to the sky, watching as the black cross with its ugly gull-wing silhouette grew rapidly in size, transforming from a dot into a monstrous bird of prey, ready to sink its talons into their hearts. Everything Anna had taught them, their entire nerve-racked system, their mechanical rhythm, it all collapsed in an instant in the face of this concentrated horror hurtling towards them. But it was at that very moment, when all seemed lost, that something no one expected happened. Katya Sokolova, the quiet, concussed Katya who had been acting like a sleepwalker, suddenly snapped out of it. It was as if ice-cold water had jolted her from her stupor. In her cloudy, detached gaze, her former sharp, razor-like intelligence cut through. She, more than anyone, understood physics. She understood that they had only a few seconds, a single, fleeting moment. "Vertical!" she screamed, louder than she ever had in her life, her voice cutting through the siren's wail. "Anya, it's coming in almost vertical. Angle 90. Range minimal. Fuse on impact!" Anna didn't understand at first. Her mind, stunned by fear, refused to process the information. Firing at a diving bomber was considered practically impossible. The speed was too great. The distance changed too quickly. But there was such a steely mathematical certainty in Katya's voice that Anna obeyed instinctively. "Shrapnel! Fuse on impact! Load!" she commanded, not fully believing what she was doing. Daria, still sobbing but now obeying the general mad impulse, rammed the shell home. Katya seized the hand wheels, spinning them furiously, cranking the gun barrel almost vertically upwards to its absolute limit. She wasn't aiming in the usual sense of the word. She was simply pointing the barrel like a spear, like a last desperate barrier against the death flying towards them. "Fire!" Anna breathed out. A shot. The gun jumped so violently it seemed to lift off the ground, the trails digging another 1/2 meter, about 1.5 feet, deeper into the earth with a monstrous screech. They didn't see where the shell hit, because in that same fraction of a second, the earth split open. The bomb, dropped by the Junkers a moment before it was possibly hit by their shell, did not strike their position. It struck the position of the neighboring, already silent gun, about 30 meters, around 100 feet, away from them, a place where there was no one left alive. But the explosion was of a monstrous, unimaginable force. For a moment, their trench turned into a boiling cauldron of fire, molten metal, and flying earth. Anna was thrown against the gun shield so hard that her vision went dark and her ribs cracked. When her sight slowly returned, she saw that their world had finally and irrevocably collapsed. The explosion had destroyed all the ammunition boxes that Lena and Daria had so painstakingly dragged closer to the gun. Dozens of shells had detonated simultaneously, multiplying the bomb's effect many times over. Where they had stood, there was now only a huge black smoking crater, and Lena, the youngest, who dreamed of a white silk dress with polka dots, had simply vanished. She was gone, completely, as if she had never existed. Daria lay at the bottom of the trench, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle, and protruding from her thigh, having pierced the thick fabric of her breeches, was a large smoking shard of red-hot metal. She was screaming. A terrible, inhuman, piercing sound. Katya sat leaning against a mangled wheel, staring at her right arm. It was covered in blood. A large piece of shrapnel had gone clean through her shoulder, shattering the bone. The gun was mutilated. The barrel still stubbornly pointed at the sky, but all the sighting mechanisms had been swept away by the blast wave. Katya's brilliant Zeiss sight was reduced to a pathetic heap of shattered glass and bent metal. This was the end. Complete and final. The sky above them was still just as black with planes. The wail of sirens did not cease. Anna lay on the ground, and for the first time in that endless hour, she felt she could go on no longer. It had all been for nothing. Their struggle, their sacrifices, their downed planes, it was all utterly meaningless. But then she heard Daria's terrible thin scream, and she saw Katya, gritting her teeth until they scraped, trying to tie a tourniquet on her wound with her left healthy hand, using a scrap of her tunic. They were still alive. 2 out of 6. And then Anna got up. Staggering, deafened, wounded by small shrapnel fragments in her back and legs, she rose. She crawled to Daria, tore open her own first aid packet with her teeth, and, as best she could, tried to dress the horrific wound to stop the gushing blood. Then she made her way to Katya and helped her. And only when she was sure they were both conscious did she return to her dead gun. She looked into the shattered, useless sight, then at the red, hot, mangled barrel. And she realized the fight was not yet over. As long as she was alive, as long as the gun could still fire somehow, the fight was not over. "Katya," she said quietly but firmly, "count. Just give me the numbers. Approximately, by eye. Azimuth and Angela." Katya looked at her with uncomprehending, pain-filled eyes. "How? The sight is gone. Just look at them and shout, and I'll aim down the barrel, like a shotgun." It was pure, unadulterated madness. Firing an 85mm anti-aircraft gun by aiming down the barrel was tantamount to trying to drive a nail with a microscope, but they had no other choice. Their final battle with the abyss was like a death throw, the desperate gesture of a drowning man trying to grasp a straw with his last ounce of strength. This was no longer a fight calculated for victory or survival. It was an act of pure, furious, irrational defiance, an act of refusing to die silently, lying in the mud. Anna, limping, leaving a bloody trail behind her, now hauled the last surviving shells herself from a distant box almost completely buried in earth. With great effort, straining her muscles, she lifted them, inserted them into the breach. Daria, lying on the ground and periodically losing consciousness from pain and blood loss, still tried to help. She pushed the shells towards the loading tray with her one good arm, her face gray with strain. Katya, clutching her wounded shoulder to somehow numb the pain, sat on the parapet, squinting against the smoke and sun, and shouted out numbers. These were not precise data, but rather intuitive guesses based on her deep, innate understanding of ballistics and geometry. 10 right, angle 45, angle. "Come on, Anya, come on, it's getting away." Anna, pressing her cheek to the hot gunpowder-scented metal of the barrel, tried to catch the black silhouette of another bomber in this improvised makeshift sight. She fired again and again, to the point of complete exhaustion. The shells burst somewhere in the sky, but they didn't reach their targets. Their gun, their faithful comrade, was dying. From the monstrous overheating, the breech block began to jam after every shot. Anna had to force it back into place with inhuman effort, kicking it with her boot. After each shot, the red-hot smoking casing was no longer ejected automatically. It had to be knocked out of the breech with the heavy cleaning rod. They were deaf. They were blind. They were almost dead. But they kept firing. They didn't know that down on the ground, the total chaos of a general retreat had already begun, that their position had long been considered destroyed, and all its personnel presumed dead, that they had simply been forgotten, struck from the lists. They were alone in their own small fiery universe composed of pain, fury, and hatred for this merciless, roaring sky. And at some point, when their strength had all but left them, a miracle happened. One of those irrational, impossible, inexplicable events that sometimes occur in war. Another shell fired at random, blindly in desperation, found its target. It exploded directly under the belly of a heavy Heinkel 111 bomber. The plane broke apart in midair like a dry twig, and its burning wreckage rained down on the earth. It was their third downed plane, and it was their last. Immediately after that shot, the gun made a terrible, grating death rattle sound. The barrel was jammed in the recoil mechanism. That was it. It fell silent forever. Their faithful little swallow was dead. And it was at that very moment, in the sudden silence that fell, broken only by Daria's soft moans, that they realized the roaring in the sky had begun to subside. The stream of planes was thinning. The main, most terrible shockwave had passed. The sky above them, slowly, reluctantly, began to empty. The air raid was ending. Anna sank to the ground next to her dead gun. She had no strength left. She looked at Katya, at Daria. They had survived. 3 out of 6. The price of this impossible victory was horrific. And it was at that moment, when it seemed it was all over, that a man ran out of the woods from the direction of the rear towards their position. He was an officer, some lieutenant from division headquarters, his face distorted with terror and haste. He ran, crouching, clutching a useless pistol in his hand. He was apparently trying to break through to the front line to assess the situation. When he saw them, 3 blood-soaked girls caked in soot beyond recognition by a shattered smoking gun, he froze in his tracks. His face registered absolute, total, boundless amazement. He looked at them, then at the hundreds of shell casings that littered the ground like scales, then at the 3 distant pillars of smoke on the horizon where the planes they had shot down had fallen. He couldn't believe his eyes. Who are you?" he whispered, unable to utter anything else. "Sergeant Kovaleva's crew," Anna answered hoarsely with her last bit of strength. "The battery. I think it's been completely destroyed." She thought this was salvation, that now they would be taken away, given medical aid, that their fight would be recognized and honored. She didn't yet know that salvation would turn into a new, even more cruel and humiliating torture. The torture of oblivion. The lieutenant, whose name history has not preserved, looked at them as if he had seen ghosts risen from hell. He didn't ask how they had survived, how they had managed to shoot down 3 enemy planes, or where they had found the strength to continue the fight. He was concerned with something else. He was a staff officer, a man of the system, a cog in the vast military machine, and right now, that machine was collapsing before his eyes. He didn't need heroes. He needed information, dry facts for a report. Where are the others? Where is the platoon commander? Why was the battery silent? He asked hastily, almost rudely. Anna silently nodded towards the blast-torn dugout where Lieutenant Orloff remained forever. The officer glanced inside, turned away in disgust. "I see." His gaze was cold, detached, appraising. To him, they were not heroines, but merely surviving witnesses to a total catastrophe. Inconvenient living witnesses. He helped load the seriously wounded Katya and Daria onto a 1.5-ton truck that had miraculously survived in the woods. He ordered Anna to follow him to headquarters. The euphoria of rescue, if it ever existed, vanished instantly. In its place came a bitter, cold disappointment, like an autumn rain. No one said thank you. No one admired their inhuman fortitude. Their short, furious, victorious battle was just one of thousands of nameless episodes on the first day of the war, already sinking into the general chaos, the rumble of tank columns, the panicked reports of breakthroughs and encirclements. At the division headquarters, which was hastily evacuating, absolute hell reigned. There was no communication. Orders were given and immediately countermanded. Officers snapped and screamed. Anna was interrogated several times. First by some grim major from the special department, then by the division commander himself. They didn't believe her. 3 downed planes? By a crew consisting entirely of girls, with a malfunctioning gun, without an officer's order? It sounded like the ravings of a madwoman, a pathetic attempt to justify engaging in combat without authorization and losing almost the entire personnel. Her story was too incredible, too heroic, and too inconvenient against the backdrop of general defeat and panicked retreat. It was easier to write it all off as confusion and chaos. "Do you understand what you're saying, Sergeant?" The division commander, an elderly colonel with eyes red from lack of sleep and despair, said tiredly, almost paternally. "We have a division in a cauldron. Communication with the army is lost, and you're telling me fairy tales. Write in your report what I tell you. Engage superior enemy forces, fired until the last shell, gun disabled as a result of a direct hit by an aerial bomb. And not a word about the downed planes, not a word about their feet, not a word about Lena, who had simply vanished. They were just erased. Their battle, their sacrifices, their impossible victory. All of it was buried under the dry, soulless lines of a clerical report. It was civilization's ultimate irony. Surviving a fiery hell turned out to be easier than proving one's righteousness in the quiet of staff offices. Salvation had turned into a new prison, a prison of silence and oblivion. Anna signed everything they gave her. She had no strength to argue, to prove, to scream. She was empty. The steel spine that had held her up in battle had broken, crumbled to dust. They gave her a new, clean tunic to replace her scorched and blood-stained one, and sent her to the rear with other refugees and retreating soldiers. She never saw Katya or Daria again. Their traces were lost in the vast, merciless meat grinder of 1941. The system she had defended with such desperate fury repaid her in the cruelest way possible, with complete oblivion. Their feat was deemed too incredible to be true. And the truth, as is well known, is the first and foremost casualty in war. The order to disband their crew due to its effective annihilation was the final, most brutal blow for Anna. Their small brotherhood, forged in battle, was destroyed with a single stroke of a pen. Their story was buried alive, just like their fallen comrades on that nameless, scorched hill near Brest. The fates of the surviving girls, like the fates of millions of other people ground down by the merciless millstones of war, turned out differently, but were equally tragic. Their paths diverged on that very day, June 22nd, and never crossed again, leaving them only as ghosts in each other's memories. Daria Zubova, who had suffered a terrible leg wound, died of gas gangrene 3 days later in an overcrowded field hospital, suffocating with the moans of the dying, which had been set up in some village school. She died during another bombing raid when the wounded could not be evacuated in time. They hadn't even had time to properly register her, and so she was left in a huge mass grave on the outskirts of a nameless village as an unknown soldier. Her rebellion, her animal fear, and her short, furious return to duty, all of it vanished into obscurity along with her. Katya Sokolova, the genius gunner, survived. The shoulder wound turned out to be severe but not fatal. After several months in rear hospitals, she, as a valuable specialist with a unique mathematical education, was discharged from frontline service and sent to a staff position in the artillery command. She spent the rest of the war over maps, slide rules, and calculation tables, paving the way for the fiery onslaught of Soviet artillery from Stalingrad to Berlin. She made a huge, invaluable contribution to the future victory, but she never, to anyone, uttered a single word about that first battle. Firstly, there were orders to remain silent. Secondly, the memories were too painful, too terrifying to be let out. After the war, she returned to her home university, graduated with honors, defended her dissertation in theoretical physics, and became a respected professor. But her students noticed she had a strange quirk. She was terrified of clear, pure blue skies and always walked with her head bowed low, as if afraid of seeing something terrible there. She died in 1986 from a sudden heart attack. In her papers, among complex physics formulas, they found an old, yellowed notebook filled with rows of numbers. They weren't formulas. They were ballistic calculations for an 85mm anti-aircraft gun. Anna Kovaleva went through the entire war, from the first day to the last. After her feat was consigned to oblivion, she was assigned to a regular infantry unit. She was a combat medic, dragging the wounded from under fire. She was a signaller, laying wire under shelling. She even went on reconnaissance missions to capture a tongue. She survived against all odds, as if death, having once retreated from her, no longer dared to approach. She returned home with 2 orders of the Red Star and a completely white streak in her hair. She married a fellow veteran, had children, worked at a factory. She tried with all her might to live an ordinary, peaceful life. But that first hour of the war never let her go. Every night she had the same nightmares. A roaring black sky, a red-hot gun, and the faces of her fallen comrades, especially Lena's face, which she tried to remember but couldn't. She never spoke of that battle, not even to her closest family. What could she say? That they, 19-year-old girls, had single-handedly held off an air armada for an hour? That she had struck a friend to force her to fight? That there wasn't even a grave, not a single bone left of their Lena? The world was not ready for such a terrible, inconvenient truth, and she herself was not ready to bear that unbearable burden. She lived a quiet, unremarkable life and died in the early 2000s, in her bed, surrounded by her loving grandchildren. At her funeral, they spoke of what a good mother, grandmother, and conscientious worker she had been. And no one present knew that beneath this modest image was hidden the commander of an anti-aircraft crew who was the first to meet the Great Patriotic War and win her own small, unknown, but no less great battle. The experience they endured changed them forever. They won their battle with the abyss, but lost their clash with the larger world. Their scorched souls were never able to fully return from that fiery, bloody morning. And as the coffin with Anna Kovaleva's body was lowered into the grave in an old cemetery in a small Ural town, no one noticed a lone passenger plane flying high in the clear sky, leaving behind a long white trail, like a final belated salute. The official history of the war is a history of great battles, strategic operations, and the names of great commanders cast in bronze. In this dry, calibrated history, there is and can be no place for a small anti-aircraft crew consisting of 6 female volunteers. In the thick volumes of the Ministry of Defense archives, you will not find reports of 3 enemy planes shot down on the early morning of June 22, 1941, in the vicinity of Brest. This feat was too small, too localized, and most importantly, too incredible to make it onto the pages of the official chronicles. It was first buried under the classification secret, and then forgotten altogether, erased from memory by the soulless military machine and post-war censorship as an inconvenient truth against the backdrop of the overall tragedy. But the history of the human spirit is not written only on paper with official ink. It lives on in legends, in tales, in whispers, and the story of the female anti-aircraft gunners did not die. It survived, It turned into a soldier's yarn, one of those frontline legends passed on in whispers and smoky dugouts and around dying campfires. It was said that somewhere on the western border there was an enchanted ghostly battery. That on the morning of June 22nd, when everyone was retreating in panic, there in one forest, several anti-aircraft guns fought like devils and prevented German bombers from breaking through to strategically important river crossings. Among the soldiers who went through the hell of 1941, there was a belief that it was not people who fought on that battery, but the souls of fallen heroes who rose from the earth to defend their homeland one last time. This story became a myth of the nameless defenders of the sky, who in the darkest hour of the war stood in the path of a steel armada and did not retreat a single step. Their names were forgotten. Their faces were erased from memory. But the memory itself of their desperate, inhuman fury, of their impossible, incredible feat, continued to live, passed from mouth to mouth like a most precious testament. This legend became a symbol of that very trench-level true heroism, which is not measured by the number of awards or lines in official orders, but only by the price of blood paid and the unbroken strength of the human spirit. Was their struggle worth such terrible sacrifices? Everyone must find the answer to that question for themselves. But one thing can be said for certain. That hour they won back from death, that breach they tore in the enemy's steel armada, may have allowed someone else to be saved. Perhaps a truck with wounded soldiers managed to get across the bridge they were covering. Perhaps some group of soldiers managed to take up defensive positions and survive. We will never know. But we know that their sacrifice was not in vain, because no sacrifice made in the name of life is ever in vain. This story is not just a chronicle of one forgotten battle. It is a reminder that the greatest feats are performed not on parade grounds to the sound of orchestras, but in the mud, in blood, and in complete despair, when nothing is left but duty and the will to live. It is a hymn to the quiet, nameless heroes whose names are forever inscribed not on granite monuments, but in the very fabric of our collective national memory.